So I'm going to kick us off. My name is Lynn Vaccaro. I'm with the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and I'm joined with a whole team today that I'll introduce in a minute. So just a quick introduction to the organization that's hosting today's meeting. A number of us here on the presentation team are part of the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is one of several state-federal partnership programs that are active in the coastal zone here in New Hampshire. We're part of New Hampshire Fish and Game, and we get about 70% of our funding from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So thank you to those folks in Washington, D.C. And our mission is actually really relevant to today's conversation. We take care of about 10,000 acres of water and land all around Great Bay. And we also have an applied research and monitoring team, which means we're very often in the position where we're looking at our science, looking at the best available science from other partners and trying to figure out how we can use it to make decisions about how we protect our own lands. And so today is a great example of that, where we're really trying to connect available science with management decisions that we feel really pressured to make. And in this case, it's really all about trying to protect the long-term future of our salt marshes. And we hope that the lessons that we're learning ourselves internally can be useful to others who are involved in land protection, restoration, land management, land use planning, et cetera. So we're really thrilled to have a kind of a diverse group presenting as well as a diverse group participating in today's meeting. So these are the voices that you're going to hear from today. Corey Riley is our manager of the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. Chris is our research coordinator. Becky is a project specialist that's been working with us for about a year and a half and has been really dedicated to the project that you're going to hear about today. And then Grant is one of our many partners at the University of New Hampshire, who's one of our go-to people that we consult with and collaborate with whenever we can. And here is an outline for today. We'll start with an introduction to this project that we're just wrapping up, but that we hope will really spur some additional collaborations and action to benefit our salt marshes. Chris and Grant will give you just a little snippet about kind of the available sort of science and data that we use to inform this project. And then Corey will walk you through some of the results and findings. And then Becky will share with you some examples of project profiles that emerged from this project, places that we think are really important and promising for helping us protect marsh migration corridors. And then hopefully we'll have about 20 minutes or so for questions at the end. So please go ahead, put your questions in chat at any point. So before we jump in, it's always nice to just hear from people on the call. So I'm going to launch a quick poll with 2 questions. So if you would just go ahead and respond, and then we'll share the results in a minute. We're curious to hear just how you kind of define yourself and your role here. And then also what aspects of this project are interesting to you. Do you hope to use kind of what you learned today, perhaps for thinking about restoration, land protection, planning and policy, education, or maybe just kind of general interest in climate and climate adaptation? And I'll just leave it open for another 30 seconds or so. Looks like we got about 58 people on this webinar this morning, which is fantastic. And I'm going to end now. Hopefully share the results here. Hopefully you can see the results. It looks like we've got a lot of federal and state agency folks, which is fantastic. Some researchers, some restoration practitioners, some consultants and engineers, all people that we think can really use some of what we've learned through this project. And then in terms of how people want to use the findings, it looks like restoration, planning and policy, and climate are the most interest.
Water quality checking. And I was like, can that happen?
We
I
got
was like,
somebody,
is there like a phenomenon where it does that?
So
we got somebody who's not muted.
on 5,
That was it.
5, 6.
Yep.
All right. I think I just muted them. All right. So moving on. Thanks for responding to the poll. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Corey to give you a little introduction to this project.
Thank you, Lynn. And thanks everybody for being here. Some of these comments are going to be pretty basic for some of you because just skimming through the participant list, we have a lot of champions of salt marshes on this call. So thanks for being here. And if you ever have any questions, follow up with us anytime. But basically, the reason why we did this project is because salt marshes are such an important habitat in New Hampshire. They provide wildlife habitat, they provide mitigation from coastal flooding, they support healthy fisheries, sequester carbon, protect our shorelines from erosions and storms, and they enhance water quality by processing nutrients before they get into the bay. Our reserve was designated an estuarine habitat, and this is one of the key habitats that we focus a lot of attention on, salt marshes, not just here in New Hampshire, but actually around the country. And we've been thinking for a long time about how our coastal and estuarine habitats are going to do in the future, and in particular, in light of development patterns and climate change. Next slide, please. So we're here because we love salt marshes, and we're here because we're going to talk about salt marsh migration. So just to make sure everybody on the call has the same sort of thought in their head when they think about that term, migration, what we're really talking about is, horizontal shifts of salt marsh habitat into the neighboring lands. It's usually a pretty slow process, and typically in relation to sea level rise. So this is a little bit different from more drastic processes that might be happening in the coastal zone. Although, as Grant will tell us, there's definitely an interplay between storms or episodic events and the way that habitats shift. But when we're talking about migration, we're really talking about these areas that marshes are anticipating that they're going to move into. And so it's shifting from the salt marsh habitat is shifting into something that was previously not salt marsh, often an agricultural field, a freshwater wetland, maybe a lowland forest. So, so you'll hear terms like marsh migration corridors or marsh pathways, and those are the places that have been modeled to be sort of ripe for marshes to move into. And this picture that you see on your screen right now, those purple areas are what we're referring to when we talk about marsh migration corridors or pathways. Next slide, please. So a little bit about our funders and where this work came from. As you can see on this slide, we're a part of a larger grant with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And there are 6 reserves up and down the East Coast that all wanted to look at tidal wetland migration. Some of these reserves were in the stage where they were trying to figure out who the right partners to talk to were. Many of these reserves are trying to get their arms around relevant science products that could help inform conversations about salt marsh resilience or help model that. We were considered sort of on the farther end because we had a lot of geospatial tools in place. And so could we use those geospatial tools to prioritize certain areas and sort of nudge the conversation along about what do we do next? You can see what the overall national goals are for the project right there. And here in New Hampshire, we really were interested in creating a pipeline of potential future projects, whether that be restoration, facilitated migration, land protection, etc. So we are here today because we are coming to the end of this NIFWIF funded project. And you could see a link that just appeared to our summary report, which was just recently released. This summary report reviews both our process for how we used science and a lot of collaborative input to create some prioritization products, and then also what we did to dig into some of the areas that popped up as high priorities and have conversations about what we might be able to do next in those places to help sustain salt marshes in the future. So that summary report also includes more detailed project profiles or marsh migration opportunity maps for 12 marshes that were considered high priority and sort of ripe for nudging forward within this project. So Becky's going to talk about those again later, but that's sort of what you'll find in this final summary report. Next slide. Yeah, so what I want to just share with everybody as we start here is a little bit of like what we did during the project. So in that first phase, we took existing maps and models of migration pathways, and that includes SLAM modeling, high resolution habitat cover data and land cover data. And we're going to review some of those geospatial products that we had moving into this project in a minute. And then we tapped into partners in land conservation, restoration, academia, land use planning to think about how to prioritize areas within those migration pathways that had been modeled to move forward into action. We reviewed a lit review on marsh migration that Grant's going to tell us a little bit about, that Grant and Dave Burdick worked on. And we brainstormed and selected spatial and practical criteria to try to narrow down which areas were most promising to actually get a project going in. Then we built a mapping tool to visualize and identify those areas and did some collaborative prioritization in phase 2 and identified which marsh migration projects we really wanted to dig into. And then basically what we did after we had those areas mapped, we had a lot of conversations with experts, with people who work in those towns or in those regions, with people who have been maybe already had been working in those marshes to really understand what could happen next. And that included things like what potential interventions could happen here, who are the likely partners, what are the key things to consider in this particular area, how far along is it as a project idea. So that is all summarized in sort of these opportunity maps and the profiles that we produced. And again, the whole point here is to get a few projects ready to maybe apply for a grant in the future. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to Chris Peter, and he's going to provide a little bit of information about the data that we brought into this project that helped set the stage for the conversations that we had within the Pathway project.
Thanks, Corey. As Corey just mentioned, yeah, I'm going to hopefully set the stage a little bit for the inputs to the project. Some of it's geospatial, some of it's field, and some of it's just collaborative input. And I think as any good project does, they should look at all 3 elements. I think we've done a great job of those, especially the collaborative part, talking to researchers, talking to experts, and also talking to stakeholders like towns and abutters and stuff like that, just to make sure we get as much information as possible before we make the decisions that we need to make. And so with geospatial products, we have a lot that inform this project. One of them is SLAM, as Corey mentioned, sea level affecting marsh migration, and that is based off of high resolution elevation data through LiDAR, as well as community habitats through resolution, basically aerial imagery and water level monitoring in the future. Basically, just how are marshes, how are upland areas adjacent to marshes going to transform into marshes of the future? And then another project I want to point out is going to jump to the bottom right of the screen here. It's work by Rachel Stevens, and she actually has her fingerprints throughout all of these projects as kind of a key figure. And this is looking at resiliency of marshes throughout the country and how they may migrate around the country using geospatial. So it's using LiDAR, it's using community habitat mapping, it's using UVR, a whole bunch of other geospatial metrics, and that's done at the national level. That was also downsized to the New Hampshire level in a couple of different projects here in the far top right and the bottom left projects. I'll start with one is the New Hampshire Salt Marsh Plan. So we downscaled the national. So what we did there is we used higher resolution data, and we used just lower marsh units. We went from basically 2 marsh units in New Hampshire to like over 200 marsh units. So these units are more manageable, more easy to make recommendations on management versus 2 throughout the entire state. And then we have this awesome high resolution tidal wetland data, which is giving us plant communities in the marsh, not just like marsh and upland and ocean, but also just the ecotones within the marshes of low marsh, high marsh meadow versus brackish marsh versus phragmites. And so these are some awesome tools that inform this project. I don't want to spend too much time here because I did take a sneak peek at Grant's and Corey's slides after, and they're much better than mine. So with that in mind, I'm going to move us on to the next slide. So what did we look at for field? So there's a picture of me smiling on the right there. I'm not sure if you can see what I'm pointing at and smiling at, but I'm basically standing at the upland edge of a marsh. This is where the forest meets a marsh, and I'm pointing at rack that's about head level with me. And so obviously some storm surges, some king tides, some just larger spring tides than usual from sea level rises are affecting the upland areas inland from our marshes. And this is one drastic example of it. In the bottom left, we're seeing trees that are just dead and marshes that have moved in. And if you, this is at the western shore of Great Bay, I'll call that Shackford Point. And if you travel further to the right of that image, deep in the forest, you'll find some halophytic and brackish plants in there. So that's one of our best examples of migration. So what we've done is we've done a lot of marsh monitoring in New Hampshire since 2010, but we've only really been nibbling at the edges of the marsh and upland interface to monitor it. So basically, I'm not sure, you probably can't see by mouse, but that yellow transition terrestrial and that top figure there is what we've been kind of nibbling at. But now we've developed a new protocol that documents or that documents the upland community. So basically, how are those changing? Are they changing faster in the upland versus in the marsh? Are we gaining marsh more than we're losing marsh? And if so, well, that's one question. Another question might be, what is the ecosystem services of this marsh? What is the structure of this new marsh we're getting? And these are questions that we're trying to answer with this monitoring that we're adapting from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through Ralph Tyner's work, and he's been doing that for over a decade. Part of it is in Great Bay, and also the NERS, the National Estuarine Research Reserve, has a protocol too. And we've taken those two protocols, adapting it, and we piloted it all last year, vetted it, and then we brought it and we're putting it into practice this year and hope to do it in perpetuity moving forward. I did also want to mention, I should have mentioned this right up front, but for some reason, New Hampshire is like a hub of marsh resources, products. I showed you a couple of them, a handful of them. Data, this is just talking about some good field data we've had. Experts, not just Great Bay, but UNH through Grant and Greg Moore and David Burdick and our coastal program and so many others, and a lot of like land managers too. So it's for some reason we have I'm not quite sure, it seems quite random to me, but we have all this wealth of data and tools and people to lean on that inform this project. Lastly, and this is a good segue, is wanted to segue into what Grant's going to talk about. So we had a little bit of money to kind of ask the question, like, what is the state of marsh migration in New England, but also around the country? Because it's kind of a new topic that doesn't have that tremendous amount of research and monitoring to it. And so we had Grant try to answer some of the questions I just mentioned, of like, are we gaining marsh quicker than we're losing marsh? What are these ecosystem services like? What are some management recommendations you can make right now? What are some gaps, data gaps, some knowledge gaps that we could try to fill in the future to help with management? And with that, I'll hand it over to Grant to dive into that.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, so David and I were really lucky to be tasked with compiling a literature review about just essentially what the current state of the research was for marsh migration. And so we had a couple of themes here where we conducted a literature search. We looked at gray literature, so any project reports, any engineering reports out there. We did a call for interviews with practitioners, and a lot of people, probably some on this call, actually came on, and I got to like talk to them about what they're doing in their towns, their cities, their own land. And we also did some site visits in New Hampshire, maybe to gain some lessons through our own eyes. And so we kind of had like these 5 big topics through our literature review. And today I'm just going to give like a little sneak peek of like what three of those topics were. So first thing, what we really learned was that there's some really great work going on in New England, especially down in Connecticut and southern New England in terms of pure research out in the academic or research world. However, down in Mid-Atlantic, this is where the game is. They are publishing a lot. There are huge NSF projects. There are huge marsh migration teams. A lot of public land is being, there's been some really cool experimental trials about manipulation of vegetation to see if we can promote marsh migration. And so what we learned was really the bulk of the research and case studies are happening in that Mid-Atlantic between North Carolina to the Chesapeake. And there really isn't a lot known in terms of site specifics in New England, especially in New Hampshire as well. And so that's one thing we found was like there just isn't a lot of geographical research in our area. Second thing we found was really the 2 main drivers of marsh migration were, first, it was tidal flooding, which I think we can all probably agree, and it's the first thing that comes to mind. But the big thing was also the shallowing of our groundwater table or a rising groundwater table. The waterlogging of soil conditions is just as important for salt marsh migration as increased salinity. And so we also found that there were some really important thresholds for maybe marsh migration to even occur, including 3 to 5% annual flooding duration and at least a soil salinity of 3 to 10 parts per thousand. One of the other big things we really found out was we had to change our perspective from thinking about the marsh platform to actually what was going on in the upland when it came to marsh migration. So thinking about these marsh migration corridors. We found out if you look at Phragmites or forest, you can almost think of these as hard barriers like an armored shoreline, where they essentially act as a wall to marsh migration. Compared to things like upstream tidal wetlands and meadows and agriculture, where they don't really act like a barrier, and there could be a lag for a while where you have some mixture of halophytes and non-salt tolerant species going on before that full marsh platform develops. And lastly, it's also really important to consider other barriers to marsh migration too. I know a lot of times we think of these pristine forests or meadows or wetlands above them, but there are also a lot of other things going on. There's infrastructure, there's brownfields, there's hazardous contamination sites, there's other infrastructure. Especially in New England, we also have a lot of historic agricultural infrastructure still on our marshes. And a lot of times they might actually be in the upland of a red maple forest or wetlands or brackish marshes, such as embankments where these people are walking on in Ferry Hill Marsh, New Hampshire, where there could be nice ditches going on. And so being able to ensure that the hydrology is correct is going to ensure that marsh migration is able to take place. So we just had some recommendations for site selection, including shifting your perspective to thinking about the upland and its response and barriers in the upland to marsh migration. Definitely utilize these awesome geospatial tools coming out, like Chris said. New Hampshire seems to punch above its weight, and there's some awesome geospatial tools that came out of this project. But it definitely doesn't substitute for getting out into your site and seeing what's going on and looking at the hydrology, looking at possible impediments to marsh or the upland habitat. So the site walks and monitoring your groundwater and your vegetation are crucial. And also, I think just like Corey said, you got to have patience with these projects. These are long-term, decadal scale projects. So having a lot of patience is really important. So I guess I'll pass it on to, is it Corey, Lynn?
Yeah, thank you, Grant. So Grant helped set the stage at that first workshop along with Rachel Stevens, and they really kind of brought their science to bear and framed up our conversation and helped us all sort of shift from looking at the marsh to turning around and looking at what's upland from the marsh. And marshes, I mean, Grant's recommendations, as you could tell, also started to talk about what we could do to support marsh migration once we figured out, oh, this might be a good place for it. So some of the categories that you'll see in the final report that we talked about a lot in this project were, you know, conserving land that's adjacent to a current marsh where marsh migration may occur, restoring marshes so that they're healthy enough to sustain and migrate inland. Facilitated or assisted migration may include things like, you know, doing something a little bit different with the forest edge, or it even could be as drastic as changing the slope at the edge. So that would be actually sort of doing some manipulation in the upland corridor to help the migration happen. We also came up with a lot of sort of ideas for things that people could look at that were not parcel specific or marsh specific. So examples might be looking at sort of the railroad line through the Hampton Seabrook Marsh. Okay, well, that's sort of a overarching thing that actually you'd need to have sort of a regional approach to, or how stone walls might be impacting migration in certain locations in our region. The next category of multi-parcel marsh migration projects is like thinking about things that may be a category of land use that we could be thinking about differently. So for example, looking at, you know, schoolyards, which actually there are several in the Hampton Seabrook region, they could be potential marsh migration areas in the future. Should there be a type of project that kind of looks at that at a different scale, so it's not done piece by piece? Or thinking about neighborhood easements in an area rather than, or an easement program, rather than thinking about it from a parcel by parcel perspective. And then finally, we know that outreach and technical guidance can be an important way to move this project, a lot of the projects forward. So we recognize the need for public and private landowners to understand how to proactively manage a changing shoreline and make space for marsh migration. And that may be just things like a different mowing regime or doing something a little bit different on land that's already owned and could be a potential migration space. So next slide, please. So basically, once we kind of knew, all right, this is what we're talking about when we say marsh migration. Here are the types of projects that we think we're talking about when we are thinking about marsh migration projects. We really wanted to think about what criteria we could use to decide where the most important areas were to invest in marsh migration projects right now. And so we had beautiful big maps on tables. This was one of our first sort of get all of our partners in the room and have a lot of collaborative discussions and mapping exercises to really think through what we heard in the science, what we see in the field, and think about spatial, field, and practical criteria for where we might want to invest within that purple area, within the marsh migration pathways. And we ended up with dozens of potential criteria to consider. And the factors that emerged as the most relevant included things that you see in green here. We looked at large migration spaces and places where there's a high potential that the adjacent upland would transition to marsh. And that was something that we didn't actually have at our fingertips at the beginning of the project, but we were able to fill some data gaps, and you'll see that in a minute, in order to sort of think about the marsh migration space, not as all the same shade of purple, but as having subtleties within that migration corridor. We wanted to make sure we were thinking about viable conservation opportunities. So that might have to do with sort of what's existing on the landscape now or the ownership pattern. We really wanted to think about how the marshes could be connected to each other so that you have a higher likelihood of maintaining a large block of salt marsh in the future, and that it has a lot of opportunities to evolve over time. We know that always community and partner interest and momentum is really critical for any project for moving forward. So that was something that we took into consideration with this project. And we are always looking for projects that have multiple ecological benefits, including if it's an important breeding area for a certain type of wildlife or bird, if it's a particularly important flood storage area for a neighborhood, etc. Next slide, please. So, from the criteria brainstorming session, we came up with a list of those key spatial criteria, knowing that some of the field criteria we would have to get into later when we sort of narrowed down the field. And we created this marsh migration mapping tool. When I say we, I really mean Katie Callahan from Fish and Game. She's amazing. Thank you so much, Katie. And through Rachel and Katie, they really sort of immediately identified a data gap, which was really kind of to show the relative ease with which marshes are likely to migrate into those marsh migration pathways or corridors. So Katie conducted a land cover resistance analysis that basically used high resolution habitat data, detailed elevation information as well, LIDAR. And shown in this slide, you can see sort of these shades of yellow and brown. And that sort of combined, this is the Meadow Pond area in Hampton, if you're familiar. Yellow areas are where it's going to be easiest for the salt marsh to migrate. And dark brown areas, that in this case, it's development, but it could be a steep slope, show where marshes are less likely to migrate in. And the tool was created specifically for use during this Pathways to Salt Marsh Resiliency project, but we're happy to share it here for other people to sort of take a look at. And you'll see a link right there in the chat. And we can email all of these links after this meeting for sure. So this was helpful because, like I said, in a lot of previous analyses, the whole marsh migration corridor was sort of like one uniform color, and you couldn't tell which areas were going to be actually easiest or where marshes might migrate to first. Next slide, please. And so once we had the criteria and had been able to create this geospatial tool, we really kind of turned to our partners and their local knowledge and their professional judgment to help us figure out where we might prioritize. So we had a really fun meeting where we went over how to use that, the marsh migration mapping tool and viewer. And then we dug in and had a participatory mapping exercise where we had people split up in groups and they looked at one region. They looked at several regions that they might have some expertise in, and really kind of thought about the criteria, both the geospatial criteria and some of the practical criteria, to sort of circle areas where they thought would be promising for us to think about a little bit more, look at a little bit more closely. And what this slide shows is some of the results of that participatory mapping. And you can see that different groups circled similar areas. And that's kind of how we got a bead on which ones we really wanted to make sure that we took into consideration as we developed more detailed profiles and went on to sort of dig in with partners on more detailed conversations. And so with that, I am going to pass it along to Becky McKnight. And Becky has been amazing. She's a contractor that's been helping us with this project all along. And she's really been the workhorse of organizing all of the data, moving the project forward, summarizing information for the report. So she's going to dig into the details with you a little bit right now. Thanks, Becky.
Thanks, Corey. So as Corey said, based on the key criteria we established earlier in the project and the participatory mapping and consultation with partners, we identified 23 areas that we considered promising for marsh migration pathway protection in coastal New Hampshire. And these are shown on the slide. So it took a lot of the combining of the circles from the previous map along with a bunch of other information. So the summary report includes this map as well as a table documenting the specific project ideas suggested for these areas by our partners. So we encourage you to review these project ideas if you're working in one of these areas. And the summary report, we hope, can be referenced in grant applications or project discussions to demonstrate that these sites were identified through a science-based collaborative prioritization process. Next slide. So from those 23 promising areas, Great Bay staff focused in on 12 projects to support marsh migration, most of which are shown on this map here to the right. We selected these 12 projects because they had willing and interested landowners, partners interested in developing projects within about the next year, potential funding sources available, and they represented diverse projects that could engage a variety of partners and funders and serve as interesting demonstration sites. So as a quick reminder, the Pathways project was about supporting and advancing projects that had some component of marsh migration. So for the 12 selected projects, we accomplished this in a few different ways, some of which are outlined on this slide. The first and the biggest one we did was we created a product called a Marsh Migration Opportunity Map for 10 locations. These are succinct project profiles with maps, background on the site, local knowledge, and potential strategies for protecting marsh migration space. And all these profiles are available in an appendix of the summary report. We also convene meetings with interested parties, including bringing in municipal representatives, which we hadn't really done before. We completed outreach about marsh migration to town interest groups, such as the Town of Hampton Coastal Hazards and Adaptation Team, or CHAT. We contributed to multiple grant applications over the past year and a half to incorporate marsh migration pathway protection in the grant applications, including data and maps. We gathered and synthesized information from regional experts on topics that relate to marsh migration, and Corey had mentioned this earlier, such as the impact of historic stone walls on marsh migration. And finally, we connected marsh migration projects with potential funding sources. So we're going to discuss a few examples of these 12 projects to give you a better understanding of how we're supporting marsh migration in New Hampshire. Next slide. The first project I just want to mention is the Fair Hill Restoration Project in Rye, where we collaborated with Aidan Berry and Kevin Lucy from the New Hampshire DS Coastal Program. The coastal program's current Fair Hill Restoration Project is focused on restoration of the existing salt marsh within the 83-acre area outlined in red on that map. Restoration techniques are going to include salt marsh ditch remediation and managing megapools through runneling. The existing marsh at Fair Hill is very resilient, according to the New Hampshire Salt Marsh Plan. And one of the reasons it scores so high is because of the presence of high-quality salt marsh migration space. So a possible future phase of the Fair Hill Restoration Project may include supporting marsh migration into that large area outlined in yellow. The majority of the area outlined in yellow consists of low-lying forest. Dead trees at the northeast margin of this area are evidence that migration is already underway. However, there's a large agricultural embankment between the existing marsh and the forest that is blocking the migration pathway. The coastal program is considering modifying this embankment along with other measures to facilitate marsh migration into this area. The Great Bay National Research Reserve has supported marsh migration at Fairhill through the creation of a marsh migration opportunity map to pull together the relevant information on for future project planning and grant application writing. Next slide. This slide shows two projects Great Bay has supported: the Leverland Creek Preserve Restoration Planning Project and the Arsenal Land Conservation Project. We collaborated with Joanne Glode at the Nature Conservancy and Lori Summer at the Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire for these. Leverland Creek Preserve on the Great Bay Estuary is owned and protected by the Nature Conservancy and includes 55 acres of salt marsh. As part of a 2024 competitive bipartisan infrastructure law grant application, the Nature Conservancy, the Great Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and Ducks Unlimited have proposed habitat restoration planning, engineering, and design at the Leverland Marsh, together with Great Bay's Chapman's Landing and Stevens properties. Part of the proposed project at Leverland includes activities to facilitate marsh migration, which may include things like shoreline vegetation management, changes in hydrologic patterns to deter Phragmites or cattails expanding into transition zones, or regrading adjacent slopes. Great Bay has supported this project through the development of a marsh migration opportunity map product to summarize all the information and grant writing support. So while we were working on that, a land conservation opportunity also came about for the parcel of land to the north of Leverland Creek Preserve that includes important salt marsh migration space. You can see it on the map there. It is referred to as the Arsenal property. The potential for this marsh migration space to succeed was improved by a 2019 project replacing the culvert carrying Leverland Creek under Bay Road. The replacement allows for more natural tidal flow and aquatic organism passage. We'll add a link to the chat there for this summary of that culvert replacement project. Great Bay has supported the Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire in the pursuit of protecting this parcel by developing a marsh migration opportunity map product to use in land conservation discussions and for grant writing. Next slide. We have two more projects to discuss. This one is about Meadow Pond. This is another area that came up in our collective prioritization, Meadow Pond in Hampton, which includes large areas of migration space coupled with really complex issues, most notably development pressure, flooding of adjacent neighborhoods, and Phragmites. But there are also hopeful projects going on here, such as recent land protection and flooding abatement projects by the town of Hampton. We created a marsh migration opportunity map product for this area to summarize information gathered from all the partners. The conversations we have spurred us to hold a field trip and workshop about Meadow Pond later this summer. The objective of the workshop will be to bring together partners who work in land conservation, land use planning, restoration, and community engagement to share their past, current, and potential project ideas, to deepen knowledge about the changing ecosystem here, and to develop a vision of resilience for Meadow Pond. For this project, we've collaborated closely with Annie Cox of the Piscataqua Region Estuaries Partnership, Brianna Hagan of the town of Hampton, and Aidan Berry with the New Hampshire DS Coastal Program. Next slide. And lastly, I wanted to talk about the migration project that is in this migration project in Southern Great Bay. During all our partner engagement, the west side of the mouth of the Swampscott River, which is shown on this map here, emerged as an important area for marsh migration. This area has large parcels with large intact migration space, which is shown by the yellow and orange areas on the map. And many partners have expressed interest in pursuing land conservation in this area. In fact, 8 of these parcels have been identified as priority 1 for land conservation by the Great Bay Resource Protection Partnership. So we pulled all the available information together about the marsh migration space here, including a calculation of migration space by parcel. We then convened a meeting to explore land conservation opportunities with the Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire, municipal representatives from Newmarket and Newfields, the Great Bay Resource Protection Partnership, and the Nature Conservancy. At the meeting, we shared our knowledge about marsh migration in this area, and the group shared ideas about how to approach landowners and potential grant opportunities. This was a valuable meeting to bring folks together with different areas of expertise to focus on protecting large areas of migration space through land protection efforts. So that's the last project I wanted to go over, and I'm going to send it back to Corey.
Thank you, Becky. So basically, I just want to encourage everybody, if you're interested in what we're talking about today, to go ahead and take a look at that summary report. we really joined this project, this regional project up and down the Atlantic coast, to try to bring some value to New Hampshire. And what we hope the value that we can provide to all of you is that we've done a little bit of that groundwork that sometimes you need to do to scope out a project. We've collected some geospatial information that you might be able to use. We've summarized conversations with restoration experts, with scientists, with land managers and communities. And we are available to continue to do the types of things that Becky talked about for the projects that she highlighted. So whether that's bringing together interested parties and facilitating a meeting at our place, whether that's providing marsh migration maps and the data behind it to strengthen your proposal, or just sort of participating in a broader conversation about some of those regional or multi-parcel projects that it might require several of us to sort of put our heads together to figure out how to approach it. So we're hoping that as a next step, all of you can use this information and we can continue to be a resource from what we learned from this project. And we're available to answer any questions or to support future projects. You can contact Lynn Vaccaro if she could be our point of contact for this. But I also just want to say that we're also committed to keep learning about marsh migration. We know, as Grant said, that there haven't been a lot of science projects to really study this. There haven't been a lot of demonstration projects in our region, and we really want to help make them happen and learn from them. So the monitoring that Chris talked about at the beginning, I think that's going to help us verify these models. And as we move forward with restoration projects or facilitated migration projects, we hopefully are going to have the science behind it to be able to add to the body of knowledge here in New Hampshire, share those lessons learned, and make sure that as a region, we're getting stronger and stronger in having a lot of tools available to us to make sure that we have salt marshes in 50 or 100 years. So I want to thank everybody. And at this point, I think we can transition to Q&A.